right, welcome everyone. I know we have still the plenary going on, but just because afterwards there will be another session taking place here, I would say let's get started. And let me welcome to our session today, Safeguarding a Just Energy Transition in the Extractive and Energy Sectors. My name is Sophie Frossard, and I work as an advisor for the German Development Corporation. And I have the pleasure today here with my esteemed panelists to look at the issue of critical minerals. So in the past years, we have seen an increased demand in critical minerals that are essential for transition energy technologies such as electric cars, solar panels. However, with that new dynamic, we also have seen the increased risks of corruption with this demand. And today we want to see here what does actually research and new policy work tell us about it. And at the back end of those risks, however, what are initiatives and tools that we are presenting that are tackling those issues with us today? However, before we go into that discussions with our panelists here, it's important to have at the back of our mind that although we're facing those emerging challenges, the extractive sector has had dealt with corruption for a long time. So let's take a step back and look at what other approaches did we use in the past, which are important for us to still consider today. And for that, I have the pleasure to hear us a keynote speech from Mr. Sendua Koliwa, Director General of Mines and Geology of Côte d'Ivoire, who will outline how corruption has impacted Côte d'Ivoire and what the government has done in the past to tackle those issues. So now we can see the movie up here. And our panelists will stand up just for us to be able to read the subtitles since it will be in French.
Éminents représentants des États membres du monde, distingués partenaires au développement engagés pour la promotion de la bonne gouvernance et la lutte contre la corruption, mesdames et messieurs, les membres des organisations de la société civile, des organisations non gouvernementales, chers amis de la presse numérique et de la presse écrite, honorables invités, mesdames et messieurs, en vos rangs, grades, qualités, tout protocole confondu, je suis Koulibaly Seydou, directeur général des mines et de la géologie de la Côte d'Ivoire. Le ministre Mamadou Sanfoua Koulibaly, ministre des Mines, du Pétrole et de l'Énergie, empêché, m'a autorisé à prendre la parole pour planter la situation relativement à la lutte contre la corruption en Côte d'Ivoire. Je voudrais, dès mes premiers mots, vous exprimer mes reconnaissances pour l'occasion que vous donnez à la Côte d'Ivoire de participer à cette rencontre importante et de faire entendre sa voix sur un sujet majeur comme celui de la lutte contre la corruption. Je me félicite de la tenue de la 21e édition de la conférence internationale de la lutte contre la corruption placée sous le thème « Faire face aux menaces mondiales, défendre l'intégrité ». Avant d'entrer dans le vif de mes propos, je voudrais traduire les salutations les plus chaleureuses de M. Mamadou Sanfoua Koulibaly, ministre des Mines, du Pétrole et de l'Énergie de Côte d'Ivoire, et de son Excellence, M. Alassane Ouattara, président de la République de Côte d'Ivoire, fervent adepte et partisan de la bonne gouvernance et de la lutte contre la corruption. J'adresse mes remerciements au Conseil de l'IACC et Transparency International, initiateur de cette activité pour le développement dans la lutte contre la corruption sous toutes ses formes. Mes remerciements vont également à l'endroit de l'Agence coopérationnelle internationale allemande pour le développement en abrégé GIZ pour les efforts constants en faveur de la Côte d'Ivoire en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte des exigences de la bonne gouvernance, notamment dans le secteur des mines. Honorables invités, mesdames et messieurs, la Côte d'Ivoire s'est engagée sous le leadership de son Excellence, le président Alassane Ouattara, président de la République de Côte d'Ivoire, dans la construction effective de son développement économique et social. Cette ambition pour laquelle des efforts considérables sont déployés à travers plusieurs réformes et projets a placé au cœur de sa démarche la levée de tous les obstacles majeurs au rang desquels figure en première ligne la lutte contre la corruption. Phénomène aux conséquences sans commune mesure. La corruption représente pour toutes les économies, et encore plus pour les économies africaines, l'ennemi contre lequel il faut absolument mener une lutte permanente, seule condition de bâtir des États forts et assurer à nos populations les meilleures conditions de vie. En effet, la corruption nuit aux plus pauvres et aux personnes vulnérables, augmentant les coûts et réduisent l'accès aux services de base. Elle accèle les inégalités et réduit les investissements privés au détriment des marchés, des opportunités d'emploi et des économies. Puis, elle porte gravement atteinte à la société, à la démocratie, aux institutions dont nous nous dépendons en les affaiblissant leur crédibilité ainsi que leur capacité de mettre en œuvre des politiques publiques efficaces et fournir des services de qualité. Au niveau du secteur extractif de la Côte d'Ivoire, notamment dans le secteur des mines, la corruption se traduit par des risques élevés de blanchiment des capitaux, surtout de bonnes dans le domaine de l'achat et des ventes d'or. Elle se traduit aussi par la prolifération de l'orpaille illicite, à travers les facilités offertes par les populations aux orpailleurs illégaux pour leur installation moyennant un montant bien défini. Les conséquences de ces agissements sont multiples. La destruction de l'environnement, la perte de production d'or, la perte de ressources fiscales importantes qui auraient pu renforcer notre économie. Nous estimons à ce jour plusieurs tonnes d'or qui sortent de notre pays grâce à plusieurs complicités et plusieurs milliards de revenus, plusieurs milliards de nos francs, des revenus bruts produits qui peuvent être estimés environ à 10% de notre PIB. Mesdames et messieurs, honorables invités, au regard de toutes ces menaces et de toutes les conséquences directement liées à la corruption dans le domaine des mines, la Côte d'Ivoire s'est résolument engagée à combattre le phénomène et à promouvoir la bonne gouvernance. Tout d'abord, cette décision a donné lieu à la création de la Haute Autorité pour la bonne gouvernance. Institution transversale dont le credo est de traquer tous les acteurs de la corruption et anticiper sur toute vérité allant jusqu'à dans le sens de la corruption. Ainsi, face à ces actions, les membres du gouvernement et le haut cadre de l'administration publique sont tenus de déclarer l'intégrité de leur patrimoine. Dans le prolongement de cette institution, le ministre en charge des mines investit comme tous les départements ministériels de la mission de lutte contre la corruption en collaboration avec la GIZ et la cellule nationale de traitement des informations financières, la CENTIF, à engager des actions portant sur l'évaluation des risques et le blanchiment des capitaux et le financement du terrorisme dans le secteur minier ivoirien, l'élaboration d'un guide de procédure sur le blanchiment des capitaux et le financement du terrorisme dans le secteur des mines. De plus, pour être en phase avec les approches internationales, la Côte d'Ivoire a adopté des mesures réglementaires relatives aux sanctions administratives et à l'organisation des contrôles des assujettis en matière de lutte contre le blanchiment des capitaux et le financement du terrorisme. Par ailleurs, pour mieux mener la lutte contre les formes de corruption qui favorisent la persistance de l'orpaillage illégal, notre département a engagé une vaste campagne de sensibilisation de tous les acteurs de l'activité en veillant à associer les communautés locales, dont la connivence a été confirmée par des études menées par notre département. Cette campagne a été officiellement lancée le 8 décembre 2023 avec la Chambre des rois et chef traditionnel de Côte d'Ivoire afin de leur présenter le tableau sombre et la vision et recueillir leurs observations. La campagne se poursuivra sur tous les districts du pays dans une démarche inclusive et une méthode de proximité afin d'amener les acteurs et les populations à s'approprier l'urgence de l'éradication de la corruption dans les activités minières. En outre, la lutte contre la corruption dans le secteur des mines s'est matérialisée par la création de deux unités, à savoir la brigade de répression aux infractions du code minier et le groupement spécial de lutte contre le pareil illicite. Conjuguant leurs attributions respectives, à savoir les investigations, la répression, ces unités ont permis de réduire considérablement les complicités endogènes et exogènes au secteur des mines. En vue de renforcer son combat contre la corruption, le secteur des mines ivoirien s'est également doté d'un guide à destination de l'ensemble des acteurs et des parties prenantes relativement aux mesures de lutte contre le blanchiment des capitaux et le financement du terrorisme. Ce guide, dont le respect est passé sous la surveillance de l'administration minière, se veut un outil de référence pour la mise en œuvre des lois nationales ainsi que le respect des normes internationales établies par le groupe africain financier, en abrégé le GAFI et d'autres organisations. S'ajoute à ces actions la mise en œuvre des mesures fortes émanant de notre initiative dans l'optique d'arrêter tout mécanisme à mettre en place pouvant favoriser la corruption. Ces mesures concernent la mise en place d'un système de digitalisation dans le but de renforcer l'intégralité des trois secteurs opérationnels que sont les mines, les hydrocarbures et l'énergie. La promotion des 5 valeurs prioritaires que sont faire des choix stratégiques pouvant impacter positivement et durablement l'activité, privilégier l'intérêt général et bannir l'intérêt personnel, donner le meilleur de soi-même, poursuivre idéalement l'idéal commun pour le bien du pays, respecter les normes professionnelles établies pour chaque équipe. Tous ces engagements ont produit des résultats significatifs reconnus par les instances internationales. Eux ont valu à la Côte d'Ivoire l'amélioration de son classement mondial par rapport à l'indice de perception de la corruption Transparency International. Ainsi, de la 131e place en 2012, notre pays est passé à la 105e place en 2021, puis à la 99e place en 2022. Et depuis le mois de juin 2024, à la 87e place. Mesdames et messieurs, notre combat dans la corruption de la Côte d'Ivoire en général, et en particulier dans le secteur extractif, reste encore confronté à des défis importants. Notre département ministériel continue de mener des réflexions, d'évaluer des menaces, les chances de réussir plusieurs stratégies. En tout état de cause, une attention particulière est portée sur la question de la bonne gouvernance et de la lutte contre la corruption et le blanchiment des capitaux de financement du terrorisme. Conscients de leur mission et de leur responsabilité dans l'éradication de la corruption, nos services s'inscrivent chaque jour davantage dans l'amélioration des procédés de gouvernance et de la qualité des actions menées pour accroître la transparence, la crédibilité des résultats qui seront obtenus. Je vais terminer mon propos en réitérant mes salutations et en renouvelant au nom de toutes les nations ici présentes le vœu de mettre impérativement en œuvre toutes les stratégies de lutte contre le blanchiment des capitaux et le financement des terrorismes. Et en exhortant tous les États à faire la lutte contre la corruption une réalité pour chacun. Je vous remercie pour votre aimable attention.
Hi, everyone who also just entered into the room. Welcome to our session. We had just heard from the Côte d'Ivoire government representative for the mining industry, and as you just have heard or read, if you don't speak French, is that although corruption can have an impact on the environment, on communities on the ground, on state institutions, we are not defenseless. There are a variety of regulations, but also giving institutions the resources that they need to actually tackle corruption, but also money laundering, which is linked to to the mining sector. But now turning to our esteemed panelists, let me introduce you who you will be speaking to or hearing to from today. And to our right, we have here Clancy Moore, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Transparency International Australia, and who is overseeing a global mining program in over 20 countries. Then here next to me, we have Susanna Fitzgerald, who is a governance officer at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, and who is carrying out research and advocacy on preventing corruption in the critical mineral supply chains. And then here on my left, we have Gay Ordenes, who is the technical advisor and the anti-corruption lead at the International Secretariat of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, short EITI. And then last but obviously not least, we have here to my left Luca Maiotti, who is the policy analyst in the minerals team at the Center of Responsible Business Conduct at the OECD. And in today's panels, we will have two sections, with the first section actually looking at what risks are out there and what is the impact of corruption risks at our communities. And then in the second part of the panels, we will then actually look at what do we do about it? What initiatives, what tools, what does research say about it? And at the end, we still will have 20 minutes for Q&A and then have closing remarks by Brooks Jonsson, who is sitting in the front with you in the audience and who is, sorry for reading out your title, working as an experimentation, innovation and learning team lead with USAID's Anti-Corruption Center. So welcome you as well. But then let me first turn into Clancy Moore. So tell us about what has TI Australia found out about the current risks in the critical minerals sector and potential impacts that you see out there.
Sure, thank you, Sophie. Firstly, Wominjeka, everybody, which is welcome in the traditional language of the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional owners of the land where I live, in Melbourne, down the very bottom of Australia, a long, long, long way away. So actually now it's about 4 a.m. in Australia, so I'm a little bit jet lagged, but I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to outline a bit of research. I was also going to outline some solutions, but maybe I'll do that in the second part. I clearly didn't see the agenda properly, so sorry. But I also want to leave you with some hope as well. But I'm going to start with a story. But firstly, just a little bit about Transparency International. So we head up the Global Mining Program on behalf of Transparency International globally. And traditionally, we've focused on addressing corruption risks in the licensing phase of the mining value chain. We know that about 1 in 5 cases of foreign bribery happen in the awarding of licences, and about 1/4 of all corruption cases in the mining, oil and gas sector happen at the very start of a mining operation, when licences are awarded as well. So we've done a lot of research using our macro tool, which is the Mining Awards Corruption Risk Assessment tool, in about 20 countries around the world, assessing those corruption risks at that really important licensing stage. For anyone who came yesterday, thank you for coming yesterday as well. We also work on business integrity, but increasingly we're looking at issues around the energy transition. So ensuring that the scale up of critical minerals is done in a corrupt-free way as much as possible, but also ensuring that the phase out of fossil fuels is free from corruption as well. But I'm going to start with a story about Australia, and I'm also going to end with a story about Australia. Although we have a global perspective, I think it's often best to kind of focus on one's home as well. So the story I'm going to start with is about an Australian mining company called AVZ Minerals. Publicly listed company, one project, one licence in the DRC. A couple of years ago, they had the licence for the biggest lithium deposit in the world. And just recently news was brought to light, some documents that we had access to, that this company had offered to pay $6 million to a middleman as part of a plan to win the backing from the president of the DRC, a spy master, the president's wife, and other high-ranking foreign officials. This was in a fierce battle with Chinese interests to secure one of the world's biggest lithium deposits. The chief executive, Nigel Ferguson, and this is all on the public record, so I'm not going to get sued for defamation, luckily, I hope. He was quoted as saying that he was working with a middleman who he expected to become the next Prime Minister at some stage. In another file that we had access to and journalists had access to, it actually showed that he wired $1 million US to this middleman without the approval of his board to help secure the rights and support from Congolese officials. So we know that the company was planning to spend about $5 million in alleged bribes or payments to middleman without any due diligence and a complete failure of the anti-corruption controls. How does this happen? How does this company get away with it? This example also shows the fierce competition that is playing out for the world's critical minerals. In this instance, an Australian listed company with shareholders, mums and dads, but also institutional shareholders, was in a fierce competition with Chinese companies to win this very lucrative mining license as well. We also know that there are allegations of a Chinese fixer involved in this case and some issues around company ownership and the awarding of the license as well. A little bit later in the story, the government of the DRC actually took the license away from AVZ Minerals, and now the company is using international arbitration, out of court arbitration, to try and seek compensation from the government of DRC. This whole time, the mine hasn't been operating, and it's the people on the ground who are suffering and missing out on this revenue. So why is this case important? Well, one, it shows the risks around the awarding of licenses. Two, it shows the increasing threats and risks around geopolitics and the competition for minerals that's playing out, particularly in lithium and nickel and other critical minerals. It also shows poor due diligence, but ultimately lack of accountability and how communities often lose out as well. My last story is a bit more positive, but I'll get to that at the end.
Just stating we have 1 more minute.
Okay.
Just on interest
Cool.
of time. Thanks.
So just quickly, in terms of some of the research, that this is the first time you're seeing today. It's going to be released in August by our global chair, Francois. What we did is we looked at the CPI, Corruption Perceptions Index, and we mapped global reserves of critical minerals or green minerals by jurisdiction and a country score on the CPI. Average score globally is 43. Anything less than 43 is deemed to be corrupt prone, highly corrupt prone. And we actually mapped out some of the key critical minerals and their perceived level of corruption. You can see that 91% of the world's rare earths, 74% of the world's cobalt, 67% of the world's nickel, 40% of the world's copper, and 26% of the world's lithium reserves are located in countries with a high corruption perception index score as well. That's probably all I've got time for. Yeah. I think just lastly, before we move on, the risk, and there are people in the room who know this very, very well, the risk of this massive fourfold increase in mineral demand for critical minerals to really power the energy transition to meet the Paris goals is that communities will miss out again, and communities will be impacted, particularly First Nations and other marginalised communities.
Thank you, Clancy, very much, and thank you for showcasing, really going through that case, which I think is taking place in a lot of other countries and also companies. So how can we now not redo the same mistakes that we did in the past and bring those stakeholders together? But let me go to you, Susanna. Why is it important for us to look into corruption? And do you have any insights there that you want to share with us?
Sure, and thanks Sophie, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks Clancy for setting us out so well. I think you've really set out the kind of why this matters and how this connects well to the energy transition and the scale up that is needed in mining and is expected, and the risks that could come with that. So I think I just wanted to delve into some of those risks a bit as well. So for us at NRGI, and maybe I should set out first as well, that we're a research and an advocacy organisation that works to support informed and inclusive decision making about the energy transition. We work both on global policy and at a regional level, but we also, most of my colleagues are based in resource-rich countries in Africa, Latin America, and a couple in Asia as well. And so from that perspective, there's two risks that I think are key to think about here when it comes to how corruption in the mining sector could undermine a just energy transition. The first risk is that the transition just won't happen quickly enough to meet Paris Agreement goals and to ensure that we get the phase out of fossil fuels that we need and the scale up in renewable technologies that we need as well. The second risk is that the transition will happen, but it will happen in a way that is unjust, in a way that exacerbates corruption, that undermines human rights, particularly for Indigenous people and for women, and that it leads to the destruction of nature through pollution, deforestation, all of these kind of things, all without doing anything to address the serious global disparities in access to energy. So I think taking that first risk of us not being able to get the scale up in renewable technologies that we need. And maybe for anyone that doesn't work in this sector, I should explain that for renewable technologies like EV batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, a lot of them are underpinned by mineral inputs, things like lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, a whole range of things. And so because of the significant demand increase for renewable technologies, then there's also this demand increase for the minerals that go into them. So in the International Energy Agency's latest global outlook for critical minerals, just for lithium in 2023, there was a 30% increase in demand. So there's a risk that corruption in the mineral supply chains could undermine our ability to scale up mining to the level that is needed. And, you know, I think we can discuss issues around demand, and there's important policies that need to be put in place to maybe address that and help us minimize corruption risks through that. But what we've unfortunately seen over the past years is that a commodity boom equals a boom in corruption. And echoing what Clancy said there, one of the key elements and stages of the mining process where we see this is in licensing. So I'm just going to talk briefly about a case where we've seen this happen, which is in Simandou in Guinea. And so now that Simandou is one of the world's largest deposits of iron ore. The first licenses for Simandou were granted in 1997. Nearly 3 decades later, the mine is still not in production. And that is due to years of legal wrangling over corruption, really complicated issues that have meant that they've just not been able to get it up and running. Now, if we were to replicate that across the transition mineral supply chain, there's just no way that we would be able to meet Paris goals. And so for the crux of what happened in Simandou, a company and an intermediary firm, again, similar things coming up again with agents, approached the then Guinean president's wife, promising her millions of dollars, signing contracts to that effect to help them secure lucrative exploration permits. After they had them, not too much longer afterwards, and after very little investment in the sector, they were able to sell a 51% stake for $2.5 billion US dollars. This was a 3,000% return on investment, and it was equal to, in the following year, the Ghanaian government's 2.4 times the Ghanaian government's entire annual budget. So I think this really communicates the human and the developmental costs that come with this corruption, never mind the impact that it could have on the energy transition as well. And then turning to the second risk, we know that mining is one of the highest risk sectors when it comes to social environmental harm. And in fact, Global Witness in their research into environmental and land defenders have found that mining is the sector that is most associated with killings. So this is something that we really cannot ignore when we're talking about a scale up, that this has to be done in a way that is fair and is just, and it doesn't lead to, particularly for communities in the Global South, becoming sacrifice zones for an energy transition that's largely happening elsewhere. So because of this at NRGI, we're really trying to more explicitly draw the connection between corruption and social environmental harm in the sector, the way that corruption enables, obscures and impedes accountability for this sorts of harm. And one of the countries that we work in where this is a big topic of conversation is Chile. So Chile is one of the world's leading mining countries, leading producer in copper and lithium. And over the past year or so, we've been doing a lot of work looking at corruption in the lithium sector. So
Also, just asking you to come to an end.
Sure, I'll just finish up this example and then I'll end. So there was a major scandal that happened a few years ago. Nearly $15 million US dollars in payments made to Chilean officials and people connected to them over a 7-year period to unduly influence policy and legislation. One of the policies that they were working to undermine was an environmental law to undermine the role of regulation, and particularly where this had an impact was in water. Where lithium mining happens in Chile is one of the world's driest places in the Atacama Desert. It's got a very unique ecosystem, indigenous communities depend on it as well, and this, I think, shows the way that this all fits together. So, yeah, I think these two examples are two of the things that we're most concerned at NRGI, licensing and undue influencing and policy capture in the space. And just briefly before I hand over to Flag, that in 2017 we did a report looking at red flags in the extractive sector in the licensing process. Right now we're in the process of updating that with a specific focus on transition minerals. We're in the case gathering stage, so if anyone here is from a country where mining is happening or is working on this issue and there's things that you'd like to draw our attention to, very happy to hear that. And I'll pass over now. Thanks.
Thanks, Susanna, and thank you so much for really displaying that. On the one hand, we have this urgency that we want to, actually tackle the climate crisis, but then in the way of doing so, we're actually working against this goal that we're trying to reach. And I think especially us working in that sector, it's important for us to have that at the back of our minds. And now let me turn to Guy and ask you of what does IITI, what findings do you have, and how do you think that we should prioritize what are effects that you're seeing at your member countries?
Thank you, Sophie. So in EITI, which is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, we are working with 56 countries. Among those countries are top producers of transition minerals, and helping them really address the risks that we are seeing in the energy transition. So our approach is a data-driven approach to fighting corruption, making sure that all the relevant information across the extractive sector value chain are transparent, that the data is out there to inform policies and to inform public debates, especially on this very important issue. But coming back to the question of what risks we are looking at right now, obviously we're looking at all the risks across the value chain, but we don't have time to discuss all of that today. I want to focus on the risk of the revenues of these mining projects being concentrated on the hands of corrupt actors. So that's why in EITI, we are really prioritizing beneficial ownership transparency. I don't know if all of you know that the extractive sector is the most corrupt sector. That's a fact. There's a study, there are numerous studies that support that conclusion. And just in Africa, 40 billion US dollars annually are lost in illicit financial flows because of activities that are linked to mining, commodity trading in mining and oil and gas specifically. So this is really a huge issue for us, and we feel that the energy transition context has increased or highlighted the importance of beneficial ownership transparency. We are currently working with 10 countries. We've launched the Opening Extractives program a couple of years ago together with Open Ownership that's being supported by BHP Foundation and USAID as well. And what we are trying to do is to really work closely with agencies to make sure that they're using BO data in their license application processes. But I'll discuss more of that later on. But we also want to, what I want to point out today is that we have a recent study, and my colleague from EITI will be distributing the QR codes to that study.
Short advertisement.
And the study has a lot of examples of cases where we have seen how these risks have really played out in countries. And I'll mention just a few. So Argentina, which we know is a major producer of lithium, we have worked with civil society and journalists in that country through the Opening Extractives program to understand the governance of lithium at the provincial level. And what they have found out is that the beneficial owners of some of the large mining companies are actually directors in financial institutions that are funding those mining projects. So there right away you can see the potential red flag or conflict of interest at play. I also want to cite an example from Ghana where they have found out through their beneficial ownership register. So Ghana is one of the first countries that have made their beneficial ownership data accessible to the public through a register. And using their beneficial ownership data, the mines department found out that actually some of the license applicants for mining projects have criminal records or have been convicted for criminal cases. So this led to the cancellation in the grant of those licenses. And then another example is from Nigeria, where also through the Opening Extractives program, we have helped them develop a tool that will enable them to cross-reference their beneficial ownership data with the asset disclosures of politically exposed persons. And the tool has been able to identify around 500 red flags in the licensing process. And they found out that about 40% of those red flags point to members of House of Representatives who have shares or direct or indirect ownerships in mining projects, and potentially are also responsible in granting those licenses to those applicants. So just a couple of examples that we can cite about the presence of conflict of interest in the license application process and why beneficial ownership is really important.
Thank you so much for this example. And I think we have heard throughout the conference how opaque structures, how secrecy of financing is enabling corruption in various sectors. And I think the extractive sector, unfortunately, is not an exception. And I think it's very important, as you stated, to see how can we have an increased attention on political exposed persons. And I think beneficial ownership transparency registers or are a key way to go. But now turning to you, Luca, do you have a case study, an example that you want to showcase with us what OECD is doing?
Sure, thanks, Sophie. And if we could put up the slides, perfect. I'm actually going to follow up on Clancy's story, although more related to a different province. It's not going to be Manono, it's going to be Lualaba and Okatonga. I wanted to present some of the findings from our report on cobalt and copper supply chains from the DRC. We wanted to look at these country and these two minerals because, well, the DRC is the producer of 70% of the world's cobalt, and it is today the biggest copper, African producer of copper. And in the recent years, we've seen let's say, a lot of scrutiny when it comes to child labor, but not enough attention has actually been paid to other types of financial crimes, such as corruption. So, quickly, following up on some of the stories we've heard, we have looked at corruption in the large-scale mining sector, or LSM. In particular, one series of cases were related to the Israeli businessman Dan Gertler, who is probably familiar to many here in the room, who is under US sanctions for corrupt dealings, for what is usually called flipping assets, buying them at a fraction from state-owned companies and reselling them at a profit with kickbacks to top officials. And just to give you a scale, a coalition of civil society organization, the Congo n'est pas à vendre, calculated that in between 23 and 2021, the state lost almost 2 billion in revenues and is poised to continue to lose them in the next 20 years, about the same amount, because of royalties pertaining to the same Gertler. I think that the Gertler case is particularly telling because at this time we are hearing concerning rumors of lobbying by Gertler itself to lift the sanctions from the US sanctions, and I would really like to take the opportunity of this platform, the IACC, to encourage US lawmakers to rethink whether that is a possibility because of, this would be particularly concerning and short-sighted. We've seen here actually the list of red flags, almost all of them have been ticked. Intervention of public officials, rigging of competitive processes, presence of an SOE, agreed terms lower than market standards, really almost all of them are ticked. And just in another case, to remind us that bribes cannot do not need to be monetary. There was a case, a settlement from BHP, where the advantage of some of the high-level officials was bringing them to the Beijing Olympics. So once again, a reminder that bribery do not need to necessarily be monetary. But maybe one added value of this report was having a look at artisanal and small-scale mining sector, which is responsible for 10 to 20% of the national production, which is so then very significant, depending on prices of cobalt and copper. And we wanted to focus on cooperatives, which under the law are responsible for marketing material, and unfortunately do not seem to do much more else than that. And their privileged position in the mining code actually gives them the possibility to extract unofficial payment for miners, because they have to pass through these cooperatives that can amount up to 20% of the pit production in our interviews. Another issue is, as you can see here, the presence of politically exposed persons in cooperatives in the ASM sector, various members of national parliaments, provincial ministries of mines, even the family of the former president, which of course creates risks of conflict of interest, as the government is responsible for awarding the artisanal mining zones where these cooperatives work. And then on another example, here you can see the list of documents that are needed in order to export a artisanal and small-scale mining production. All these are opportunities to extract illegal fees from miners who see their income then even further depleted. I also have one story from a company that was working with formalized artisanal and small-scale miners, who started to pay the DRC formalization agency by wire transfer instead of giving them cash. Now, what happened is that the division head of this mining agency realized that some of the agents had been withdrawing some of the cash, some of the payments, and not giving it to the central coffers. So, as a reaction, he suspended the payment of those agents for a few months. Unfortunately, what seemed to be a punitive sanction that would hopefully teach a lesson turned into an incentive for these state agents to extract unofficial payments from miners. I want to stop here, but before I stop, a couple of things to remember and to consider. The one related to the last example. Although abuses may happen at formalized and informal context, of course, formalized context where artisanal and small-scale mining and large-scale mining can work together actually do provide more avenues for resolution and for discussion. And the second one is that, of course, when talking about petty corruption and especially artisanal and small-scale mining, we should not forget that this actually comes on top of all the adverse consequences of grand corruption and corruption related to large-scale mining, because, of course, there is the loss of access to state services, education, but there is also a potential increase in conflict and unrest and violence, because most of these concessions actually take up all the viable mineral ore deposits. So these artisanal and small-scale miners often resort to informal, to bribery and violence to get into these large-scale mines. That's an overview of some examples from the Southern DRC. I hope that they were telling enough.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think especially your last point is very important for us. Obviously, a lot of times we have the artisanal small mining sector more envisioned because of the informality, but also to state, of course, that large-scale mining have, of course, a bigger impact just in the range of the activities, but also when we look into grand and petty corruption, just being aware that, of course, both are important, but also that behind all of those, there are different mechanisms that we have to understand. And I think even be it like petty corruption, but also grand corruption, what is the reasoning? Why are actors actually acting that way? And how can we counterpart those behaviors, let's say. But now that we heard, of course, of the impact corruption can have, but also of the potential risks that we're dealing with, we don't want to let you hopeless. So going back to Luca, tell us what the OECD does to help, let's say, also the private sector to deal with those issues.
Thanks, Sophie. And actually, your point on having a framework to actually deal with the different causes of corruption, different types of corruption. Well, we at the OECD see this document that you can see behind me, the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Mineral Supply Chains, as one potential contribution to the solution. It is a standard of due diligence that covers all of mineral supply chains. And when we talk about due diligence, we're talking about this ongoing reactive and proactive process to identify and mitigate risks of conflict financing, human rights abuses, and financial crimes such as corruption, money laundering, and tax evasion across mineral supply chains. And this is an important, I think, difference because we often see that compliance approaches often stop at first-tier suppliers. Here, the guidance does cover the whole of supply chain. It is addressed to companies. Companies need to set up management systems, use them to identify where they're buying their minerals from and metals, what are the conditions of extraction and trade, and mitigate potential adverse impacts that are linked to that production and trade. It is, of course, destined to address to companies, but civil society and governments can have an important role in creating this level playing field to enable companies to do due diligence better. This is a snapshot of what the guidance requirements are. I like this slide because it really shows how all these different actors are actually interlinked, and let's say the contribution or the influence of adverse impacts can be more tenuous when you're far away and far removed from that adverse impact, but you're still directly linked through its business relationship. And it does cover, both artisanal and small-scale mining and large-scale mining impacts. So to go back to my previous examples. When we were talking about solutions in particular, I think that one thing could be to use the OECD due diligence guidance architecture, because over the years, even though it was born as a non-mandatory instrument, soft law, we call it soft law with hard consequences, because a lot of these of countries have actually introduced the guidance as a requirement in their legal framework. So this is the case for importing countries, the European Union and the US, but also producing countries such as the DRC and processing countries such as the United Arab Emirates. Some of these, where the guidance is referenced, corruption is in there. So use this as an advocacy tool, and although we know that most of it has been, let's say, most of the guidance implementation has been focused on human rights abuses and financial and conflict financing, it does cover financial crimes, including corruption. So this can be a tool for advocacy. It's the same for industry initiatives that have made a requirement for doing business in many supply chains. There again, use it as a tool to be leveraged for corruption. Here is in a way, the added value of responsible business conduct, OECD responsible business conduct instruments. We're seeing sometimes that the definitions of due diligence that compliance officers have is not necessarily one that we can use, because these impacts are happening many tiers away from in supply chains, and most of the let's say the adverse impacts they care about in compliance is on the company, but responsible business conduct instrument at the OECD actually look at impacts to people and on the environment. In particular, to even make this more clear and really give companies no chance to say that they didn't notice that corruption was in there, we issued these frequently asked questions on how to address corruption risks in mineral supply chains. There is a lot of guidance on how to conduct anti-corruption. I think out there, what this guidance, that this FAQ does, is look at where corruption happens, sometimes beyond legal liability, sometimes in contexts where corruption may be systemic, and so it's very difficult for companies to actually engage. And it is grounded in the guidance approach, which for financial crimes such as corruption leaves a time for companies to engage with suppliers and push them to improve before actually disengaging. Finishing here, just a quick word on the structure of the FAQ that I invite you. It's freely available in 3 languages. It talks about the terminology and the circumstances of vulnerability, getting into some of these red flags, and then looking at what are the internal management systems and monitoring of suppliers, again, suppliers through the whole of supply chain that companies can set up to look at conditions of extraction and trade. And then what kind of mitigation options are there when problems happen at direct supplier, but also when problems are happening at the, let's say, far beyond tier 1 suppliers. And then the last one, because there is a public reporting mandatory requirement in the guidance, how to do that when it comes to corruption, which is a very touchy subject. I think I'm done, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think especially when we look at the UN with the new supply chain regulations, I think there's real incentive and pressure that we can put on the private sector. And obviously those guidelines, I think, or step-to-step guides are quite helpful for them. So if you know companies that want to work on the issue but don't know how to work on them, I think that's a good way to start. So thank you so much for highlighting those. But now going to Guy, you already started in your previous speech talking about some of the recommendations that policymakers, but also industry stakeholders and civil society actors can take out of EITI.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned earlier, the EITI is the global standard for good governance of mining oil and gas. And it has been implemented, it's being implemented by 56 countries. Some of these countries have been implementing EITI for 20 years. And so we have a set of requirements that data points that countries are required to disclose on an annual basis to, as I said, promote better understanding of the extractive sector. Now, what we did last year in 2023 was we further strengthened the provisions or the requirements under the EITI standard precisely to address these emerging corruption risks in the context of the energy transition. So I'm going to highlight some of the new requirements or how we have strengthened old requirements to address some of these risks. So in the new 2023 EITI standard, we have added some provisions for countries to document whenever there are fast tracking of licenses that are happening in their jurisdiction. So Clancy was referring to this earlier where, because obviously, countries would want to take advantage of the increased demand for minerals, would want to take advantage of increased revenues there, and the likely scenario is that they will deviate from legal frameworks or regulations in licensing. And so whenever those are happening, there is a requirement for EITI countries to document those and to provide a clear rationale for why those licenses were fast-tracked, and also to provide justification or explanation if there were deviations from the usual procedures. There's also a requirement about state-owned enterprises. And here I want to highlight what we are seeing, an increase of state participation also in the mining sector because of the energy transition. So under the new standard, whenever SOEs are involved in mining projects, they will be required to disclose also their suppliers, their intermediaries, their agents, and this is in recognition of the fact that recent corruption scandals involved a lot of beneficiaries, agents, and suppliers. I already mentioned beneficial ownership earlier, so I won't elaborate on that further. The other requirement that we have strengthened is on reserves. So under the new standard, there is an encouragement for countries to also disclose data about their minerals reserves. to prevent corrupt speculation and to prevent a situation where there's asymmetry of information with respect to really how much reserve does a country have, especially for transition minerals. I think community consultation is also important, and want to highlight that that is also a requirement in the new standard for countries to disclose how they are conducting consultations with communities, including processes relating to getting free, prior, and informed consent from indigenous people. So we also had a study that we launched 2 years ago where we noted that around 80% of mining projects overlap with indigenous lands. And that could potentially increase because of energy transition. So that's why we also strengthened our requirements on that. And then related to that, of course, we know that mining projects are sometimes associated with environmental risks and social risks. So in addition to what we are already requiring, which is for countries to disclose the contracts, the mining contracts in their countries, and also the payments related to environment and social obligations of countries, they're also now encouraged to disclose the contracts underpinning these social commitments and environmental commitments. So those are just some of the strengthened requirements in the 2023 standard that I want to highlight, but also want to say that at COP last year, we also, together with other partners in the renewable energy sector, we launched a call to action for transparency across 8 areas in the extractive sector value chain, some of which I already mentioned: beneficial ownership, contract transparency, state participation, etc. Just highlighting the fact that a lot of the lessons learned that we have seen from the extractive sector are also mirrored in the renewable energy sector. So some of the risks and patterns of corrupt behaviors that we have seen from the extractive sector, we are witnessing, or we are likely to witness also in the renewable energy sector. So our call is to really maintain or perhaps even improve the standards and the level of transparency in the renewable energy sector.
Thank you so much, Gay. And I think it highlights again how important it is for member countries to also join, for other countries to join the EITI as members, and how the standard also helps to guide regulatory reforms. So thank you for highlighting here the most important reforms. But now turning to you, Susanna, you have a new exciting tool that was updated. Tell us more about it.
Sure, thanks. And I think some slides should be coming up as well. I'm going to start with an apology that I'm actually extremely untech savvy, and so I don't have a QR code for you on the slides, but I've gone old school and I've just put the link in there. So sorry about that. So to explain a little bit about what the tool is, this is flexible and adaptable 7-step process that helps users to engage on sensitive topics, identify and understand the major corruption issues that they're facing in their extractive sector, and crucially build and implement effective and evidence-based action plans. So we first developed the tool in 2021, and we updated it recently with insights from uses of the tool in 5 countries. And so if you go to the website there, you can find all of the information, and it's also all there in English, French, and Spanish, which hopefully makes it a bit more accessible as well. So when we were designing this tool, the main kind of ambition that we had was that we know that extractive sector corruption is a really tough topic to talk about, to work on, and frankly, it can just feel quite overwhelming at times. It's difficult to know where to start. So we wanted to try and take this big issue and break it down into more manageable parts to make people feel like they could have effective action and work out what the key points of leverage would be. So there's this focus on making sure that actions are action-worthy, and that we take a broad approach to corruption as well. So not just things like bribery, but also looking at issues around policy capture, state capture, and the real systemic types of corruption that have so much harm as well. We really try to build in from the start, making sure that there are different actors involved, that there's buy-in from government, from companies, from civil society, of course. And the structure of the tool is adaptable because we know that corruption looks different in every sector. So briefly, these are the 7 diagnostic steps. So steps 1, 2, and 4 focus on the research part of the tool. So this is to make sure that what's happening is evidence-based. So we've developed workbooks and guides to help people work out what they want to focus on. Again, this is where the adaptable part comes in. Steps 3 and 5, they're about bringing people together, and that's where we're really focusing on this buy-in, this ownership to recommendations. So you can present the research findings and then collectively decide where you want to focus in on more, where you want to target your action. And then step 6 and 7, the last steps, they're about prioritizing solutions that will be most impactful and thinking about how you implement them. And actually step 7 is a new step that we added to the update because, perhaps unsurprisingly, that question around implementation has been one of the most challenging aspects of it. And don't worry, you don't have to read all of this. This is just for like a visual demonstration of what inside the tool looks like. So this is step 4, one of the most detailed steps. And down here in this corner, you can also see some thematic guides. So even if you don't want to go through the whole process, if you just want to know a little bit more about corruption risks in a specific part of the extractive sector, these could be useful for your work as well. And then so as I said, we've developed the updated version based of the use of the use of the tool in 5 countries. So they're on the map there, and 3 of them we're looking at transition minerals specifically. So in Chile, Guinea, and in the Philippines. Excitingly, we're also planning to use the tool in DRC, Senegal, Ghana, and the Amazonian regions of Colombia and Peru over the next couple of years. And actually, EITI have just in the past couple of weeks published a useful blog about how actors in Togo have done that as well. So lots of exciting things hopefully coming up. And I'll just finish up by briefly returning to Chile and Guinea. Interestingly, given the discussions we're having today, in both of these countries, they decided to focus on licensing and on revenue collection, which have been topics that have come up throughout the discussion. So in Chile, we saw issues around policy capture, around poorly governed community consultation coming through. In Guinea, we saw issues around payments to expedite title allocations, about bribery and subnational transfers, these kind of things as well. So the Chile process is just finished, so not too much implementation there so far. But in Guinea, we've started to see some exciting things coming through because this was finished a year ago. The anti-corruption agency in the country decided to focus on mining and target the bauxite producing region of the country for its International Anti-Corruption Day work. The National Transitional Council is looking at reforming anti-corruption laws as well, again influenced by this. And I'll just finish up by saying that despite this progress, something that we have seen in Guinea, which reflects our work elsewhere, is that there are still significant challenges. Challenges surrounding civil society capacity and resources to engage on this and to do the crucial monitoring work. Threats to media freedom that have diminished the space for freedom of expression and to talk about these issues. And lastly, to the safety of anti-corruption actors. So I think there's lots of positive things happening in this space, but if we want to have effective scale-up of implementation of all of these tools, it's impossible to ignore the environment that anti-corruption actors are working in. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Susanna, and thank you also here for showcasing us that a tool can be based on multi-stakeholder engagement and how it's important then there you need to have a civic space for those actors, obviously to work at the same level as private sector actors, but also as government representatives. So thank you for highlighting that. Now going back to you, Clancy, you have already said at the beginning that TI Australia also have some initiatives and that sphere, so excited to hear about it.
Sure, thank you. I should also disclose that I'm a civil society board member of the Extractive's Industry Transparency Initiative, so sort of oversee the great work that Gay and others do at the Secretariat with a very large board of private sector, government and civil society people as well. Just to reflect on a couple of the other comments we've heard, Gay mentioned that some of the challenges in the renewable sector are very similar to the extractive sector. Agree. I went to a session on carbon markets, same challenges. I went to a session on shipping. I know nothing about shipping, but I can tell you what, they've got the same challenges as carbon markets, renewable sector and the extractive sector. So I think there's a lot of history and experience to draw upon from the extractive industries transparency initiative with these other sectors as well. We want to inspire a bit of hope and some solutions, and just thinking about our colleague from Côte d'Ivoire, whose country went from 130th in the CPI to 87 in a decade of real progress. That's significant hope and that's significant progress as well. So I'm going to just touch on 3 solutions and 3 areas that I think are worth reflecting on as we leave today and after the last session as well. And these really look at preventing, detecting, but also addressing corruption and foreign bribery, holding corrupt actors to account as well. Firstly, on the EITI, it's 20 years old, but there are still countries looking to join, particularly Chile, which has signified an intent to join, large energy transition minerals country, but also Malaysia, which has deep reserves, not only of oil and gas, but also rare earths as well. Within the EITI standard, there's a strong focus on beneficial ownership, and that's the second thing I'd like to highlight in terms of solutions and positive developments as well. Despite the EU ruling of 2022, many countries have legislated, have developed rules, or are in the process of establishing beneficial ownership registers. Many of these countries, like Canada, and I'd just like to point out Sasha Caldera from Publish Where You Pay Canada, who with other groups got the Canadian government over the line to establish a beneficial ownership register. In Australia, my country, progress is a bit slower, but they've committed to a beneficial ownership register. In the US, there are moves underway for a beneficial ownership register. These countries house a lot of mining, but also have mining companies operating around the world. Australia has 700 mining companies in 100 countries globally, okay? Similarly with Canada. We're also seeing improvements in Zambia, the Philippines and Indonesia around beneficial ownership as well. Open Ownership, one of the peak organisations working on this issue, are developing a kind of framework around interoperability, getting data that can be used across registers, piloting a process with UK, Denmark, and I think Slovakia, sharing beneficial ownership data, which is also really important. The EITI standard has increased requirements about beneficial ownership disclosure, including PEPs, which is very important in a place like Indonesia and potentially in the Philippines, as I think Gay mentioned as well. The standard now also encourages disclosure below 10% ownership, which is huge. Most registers require 20 or 25% ownership to be disclosed. In the EITI, it encourages 10% or less. There's also a requirement for SOEs to have disclosure around beneficial ownership as well. So that's the second, I think, ray of sunshine in the area of combating corruption in the extractive sector. The last thing to focus on, and this is really the accountability aspect and the lack of accountability that we've seen for so many years around corruption in the mining, oil and gas sector as well. Just April this year, the Australian government passed historic laws to combat foreign bribery, quite similar to the legislation in place in the UK. These laws have a strong focus on a failure to prevent, a new offence which can find companies guilty of foreign bribery or intention to commit foreign bribery as well, but also allows them to demonstrate adequate procedures in the defence of that particular crime type as well. In the US, there's a new act called the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, which looks at the demand side of foreign bribery. Authorities can prosecute foreign officials who demand or accept bribes from a US company. The EU has a directive, which is looking at potentially foreign bribery as well. And I hope Canada can join this illustrious club of countries that have foreign bribery rules in place. So just 3 examples. There is hope, things are improving. We've still got a long way to go. It's a marathon, not a sprint, as I think Francois mentioned today, but progress is happening. And I think other sectors can look towards the extractive sector and take lessons from these significant wins. Thank you.
Yeah, Clancy, thank you so much. And first of all, let's give a round of applause for our speakers. And now, before we go into our closing remarks, I will open the floor now to your questions. I think we will have a microphone. So now is the chance if you want to ask your spicy questions to our speakers. So is there anyone? Yes, we have a question over here. Please introduce yourself and keep your question short and crisp. Thank you.
Thank you. Jackie Peace from the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK. I work on beneficial ownership transparency, so very encouraging to hear about the progress and see that highlighted. With the increasing availability of beneficial ownership information, are you finding that countries and governments and civil society are able to use that information effectively, or do we need to think about new ways of supporting users to make best use of that information? Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah. Do you want to have maybe a couple of questions, then we can answer them?
Sure. Is there another question, or do people need more time to think? Yeah, we have one over there.
Thanks so much, Sasha Caldera from Publish What You Pay Canada. Appreciate the shout out, Clancy. So my question's actually it builds on Jackie's, and it's about politically exposed persons and heads of international organizations. So we tried to get that kind of disclosure also included in our own beneficial ownership registry, but it was just too ambitious at the time. And we've recognized that there are no open PEPs lists or HIO lists available, and I'm just wondering if that's the same experience in many of the EITI countries, and how are countries going about PEP screening and HIO screening?
Thank you. Is there a third question? Yes, over here.
Hi, I'm Ahmad Kisai from USAID Indonesia. Just a quick sense on your feeling. I think you mentioned about Indonesian work and open PO and everything. But the new government is coming. The current government is not really reflecting on the spirit of beneficial ownership. So how do you see the future of this work in Indonesian context? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our last question over there, and then we go there in the corner, and then we go to our panelists.
Hello, this is Typhoon from UNDP. I would like to ask Gay about, I've seen your member countries of EITI, but only Iraq is member within the MENA region, despite the fact that the region is basically well known with the oil industry. So I wonder the reason behind it, and I also would like to raise whether you also have seen the same, similar trends from the MENA region, especially. You have both the developing and developed countries, which are quite well known with the extractive industry. So thank you.
Thank you. So we have questions on beneficial ownership transparency, also Indonesia, PEPs, and EITI membership. I will start from there to there.
Sure.
If you want to add something, Clancy, please.
Firstly, Jackie, is it? Yes. Thank you so much for your question. I'm in London next week meeting with some of your colleagues, so maybe we can catch up. I'd also invite you to reach out to our Australian colleagues and put a bit of subtle pressure on them to get their act together in terms of a beneficial ownership register, just between you and I, and the people recording, listening to this session as well. Clearly, beneficial ownership data needs to be accessible, open, machine readable, all those open data standards that we know about. Otherwise, it's really hard to navigate. Okay, I've done some investigations. I talk to people in banks. The more accessible, available the information is, the better it is, right? Banks like it because they can do know your customer checks. Journalists like it because they can check corporate structures as well. Unfortunately, a lot of the data isn't in open data format. So I think there's standards that should be applied by all governments, and I encourage you to reach out to people like Open Ownership, Transparency International, ask them for advice, consult with us. We can help. I'll probably get Gay to talk about the Indonesian examples, and maybe some other people have more insights than me on PEPs, but that's my initial response. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. First handing over to Susanna.
Sure, thanks. And I think on this first question, maybe I'm going to speak slightly more from my old hat, which was working for the UK Anti-Corruption Coalition and TI UK. And I think our experience in the UK of having a beneficial ownership register and having that relatively early, that it's not just about the availability of the data, it's about the quality of the data. And I think that's something that's really essential to be looking at and thinking through when we're trying to address this question. And then I think to Sasha's point as well about PEPs, I think thinking about how we can connect different data sources is something that we probably need to be better at in the anti-corruption community, I think, and for our corruption diagnostic tool, the first use in Mongolia, that was actually one of the recommendations that came through to the anti-corruption agency to be better at connecting up the information that they're finding from different sources. So, for example, in the country, they actually gather information, they have asset declarations, but this wasn't connected up to the work of the tax authorities. So there would have been a way to assess from, people's income, if they're buying luxury items, all of these kind of things. You could ask questions about where the money's coming from, but because people weren't working together, they were kind of limited in their ability to do that. So yeah, I think thinking about PEPs and other sort of information sources and how we can connect that to BO is really important. And I think I'll also leave the Indonesia question for Gay. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you want to, especially the PEPs question, maybe also?
Yeah, very briefly. I maybe just wanted to follow up on the last two interventions on the first question again. These data are used not only by CSOs, civil society organizations, but also companies when they're doing due diligence. This is actually super helpful when it comes to doing some basic checks. Of course, we know that major compliance efforts do not stop at KYC, at beneficial ownerships in countries such as the UK, but actually going towards there again, taking a supply chain angle, looking at where beneficial ownership is available in some of these producing countries, for example, is supremely helpful. So yeah, I'll just stop there and just highlight once again that yes, it's super important.
Okay, thank you. Guy, please.
In one go. The question on data use of BO, yes, that's a concern. To be frank, data use is one of the things that we should also be focusing on, because right now we've done a lot of trainings, capacity building on data use, but mostly on an ad hoc basis, where we work with journalists, we work with civil society, and so forth. But what we really want to do is to institutionalize data use within agencies. So what I was mentioning earlier, it's a support that we are providing for some countries under the Open Extractives program with open ownership. We have identified a few countries, Indonesia being one of them, Philippines, Zambia, to help their licensing authorities use beneficial ownership data in their license application process. Because we feel that when we talk about BO data use, it shouldn't be on an ad hoc basis, but it's something that you need to mainstream into your, regular government processes. So that's one thing that we're focusing on right now. On Sasha's question on PEPs, yes, this has been a challenge. We have the same observation. We don't have a lot of good databases on politically exposed persons. What EITI countries have been doing is that they are directly collecting that data from the mining companies. So in alignment with their EITI reporting procedures, because companies are required to report to EITI their beneficial owners on an annual basis, they are being asked in that process to declare whether any of their beneficial owners are politically exposed persons. So that's the data collection process that we're doing right now. But we are also looking into the possibility of linking that data with asset declarations, but as you very well know, very few of those exist, or if they exist, they're not even publicly available. And then a question on Indonesia, yes, that is also something that we've been thinking about. Because there's been a lot of developments in Indonesia. Indonesia was one of the leading proponents of beneficial ownership transparency a few years back. We have not seen any, but you are the country expert, but from our perspective, we have not seen any backsliding yet on this agenda, at least within the minerals sector. As you very well know, there's a legal framework, there's a BO law in Indonesia, and in addition to that, there's also a regulation within the mining ministry to collect beneficial ownership information from licensed applicants. So I think we need to keep close watch on how things progress. But for now, I think the legal framework that is in place provides enough assurance that the work will continue on beneficial ownership in Indonesia. And then on the question on EITI membership, we have a process for how countries applying for EITI membership is assessed by the EITI board. There's a candidature application process, but one of the things we look into is whether there is an enabling environment for transparency in the country. So we look at the legal frameworks, obviously if there's political will, and most importantly, if there's genuine civic space. So that is a guiding factor why maybe some of the countries in the region you mentioned are not applying for EITI, or we have not strategically engaged them yet into joining the EITI because of some concerns in those factors that I mentioned.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering those questions. And if I may also made a bit of advertisement, I actually have a colleague sitting here, Ivan, who is a BO specialist, sorry to tell you. So if you're happy to talk to him about it, we worked with Peru, North Macedonia, Albania, several countries to support them in establishing BO registers. And for us, it was also important. That is just the first step. And then after that, the topic of data verification, but also who has access to that data, or even talking about law enforcement. Do they know that data is out there? How do I use that data? Or we saw also with Peruvian colleagues that actually data increased. So how can they analyze this data? How can AI support to analyze this data? Actually also linking that to the topic of PEPs. So I think there are creative ways on how to move that forward, but we have to think that beneficial ownership is the first step. It's not the silver bullet. And yeah, how can we use that forward? We just have 5 minutes left. Is there a very urgent question you still want to pose? If not, I would ask Brooke to come forward for our closing remarks. But before she does that, I would just give 10 seconds to each of my panelists. What is the most important next step that you say we should take forward? Okay, starting with you.
Raising, I don't want to underestimate the importance of that. We speak with a lot of governments in the EITI. There's still an urgent need to raise awareness, one, on the urgency of the emerging risks, and secondly, in understanding the types of risks that are starting to evolve because of the energy transition.
Thank you. So awareness raising. Luca, you next.
So outreach, I don't know if it is again awareness raising, but on the specific issue of backsliding. I mean, I think everyone feels this urgency of trying to secure mineral deposits and supply, and this can actually trump, cut corners, trump other types of requirements such as transparency requirements. So
securing the standards that we already have. Susanna, please.
I think for me, the one I always come back to is implementation. I think it's something that we see across our countries in different areas of work, and actually in critical mineral-specific legislation that's coming through, for example, in the EU. What looks like it could be quite good on paper is undermined, in fact, by the implementation system. So I think we really need to be looking at how we're addressing that. Thanks.
Okay, so not only legal reforms, but actually putting them into action. And Clancy?
I think for strong and secure governance of the energy transition, we need to ensure that women, Indigenous peoples and other marginalised groups not only have a seat at the table, but have equal power as much as possible in these decisions that affect them. Otherwise, we'll have another resource curse, and the 3.5 billion people who live in resource-rich countries will be left behind.
So equitable and inclusion of communities affected. Brooke, please, the stage is yours. 3 minutes.
Okay, I'm trying to read my own writing with the notes that I took, but I think I will start by saying that there's a QR code and a code for a Mentimeter poll. At the risk of having you take out your phones and get distracted by whatever else is on your phones, we would really welcome your feedback in terms of what was the most interesting or important insight that you'll take away from this panel to help you go forward and help be a champion for safeguarding the just energy transition. So would really welcome your insights. And I know how many people are in the room, so I'll know how many of you did not respond to the poll. And I'm not above calling on people. So at least pull out your phone so it looks like you're answering the poll. No, you may or may not answer the poll. So I think Clancy, I actually took out a couple of words from what you said in terms of being a ray of sunshine, and I'm gonna do that here. I will recognize with humility the significant amount of work that we have to go to keep safeguarding the just energy transition, the significant challenges that we face with fast tracking, with the rush for critical minerals. At the same time, I think that this panel genuinely highlighted how far we have gone in the extractive space, how much work has been done, and the robust foundation that we have to really make a difference and to protect the integrity of the minerals in the extractive space and move forward in the energy future. So just to hit on a few that jumped out at me from today's conversation amongst the many. Lucas, I'm going to start with you and just the volume of resources and references and regulation guides that the OECD has available really provide concrete, actionable steps and items that provide an overall framework for how we can operate. Clancy, I'm looking forward to August. You shouldn't have told us that, man. And we're all going to be hounding you for an advanced copy to see the CPI map, the map of the CPI and the critical minerals reserves. And if I hadn't been in on this coming up here now, I would have been asking you about lithium and where the other 73% or 74% resides. That was a surprising statistic to me. And then moving over to Susanna, I think having the 7-step process really allows, again, to take these big picture frameworks and foundations and to walk through the process that we have. And then finally, in my last 5 seconds, you can go ahead and show the results, please. In my last 1 second, I will just add, Kay, in terms of EITI just really being the multilateral. Can you put the results up for the Mentimeter? You don't get to know what each other said. All right, so the last is just EITI and the amazing progress you've made both at being multilateral and also or multi-stakeholder initiative, but also explicitly getting anti-corruption into the standards. What a big recent win. So here are your insights. I don't have time to go through the responses, but we will be reviewing them. And I just thanks to the amazing panel, to the audience, to our tech for all of their support and for a great IACC and second to last session.
Thank you so much. Feel free to reach out, and we look for further collaboration with all of you. Thank you.